There's something weird going on here. I think I said case, it says case 8 up here, this is case 6. I'm not sure why I have the numbers wrong, but case 6 health management, because case 6 means that we're in week 8, which week 8 is right before spring break, and you can tell it's almost spring break by the weather outside. Yeah, yeah. This would be, yeah, if you're planning like a nice spring break trip to someplace sunny and you showed up in this weather, that'll probably be pretty good. Sure, Sydney, you're probably suffering in the situation, be strong when you do it together. Yeah.
Well, it's good prep. I'm going skiing for spring break.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, that took a direction I not anticipated, so yeah, all right. Celebration. All right, so just as a reminder, we are not going to be meeting on Friday, we'll not be in class. I never have too much worry, like in my graduate classes, everybody's just like, okay, I'm pumped because I get that extra early day of spring break, and I can't speak to your other classes. I can't talk like your other instructors have said that they're going to be. Yes. I do get some weird responses. Like I got an email from one of my students in undergraduate class, and most of my undergraduate students are pretty solid. I do have a few that I've been working with this semester, and the student basically told me that the weather's just outside is frightful, and they did not want to try to make it to campus, and that's fine. I said that's cool, I understand. I said, but I'll see you in class on Friday. And it's just like, no, you won't, but that'll be between you and I guess. It's just one of those things, just wondering if students are catching that information. But, yeah, we're good here. Everybody's keeping up to date. The good news is you get the benefit from it. She won't have to be on campus on Friday, at least not for this class. I can't speak to the rest of your classes. And the other instructors basically said that they're going to bypass Friday classes. Yeah, that's good. That's good. I know Shoniwa, when he was here, he used to actually say, if Dr. Barnes cancels this class, I'll cancel mine. And so my students tried to get guilty into it. I just never had any of that. It's like, nope, I'm not going to do it just because Trevor said it. But even more so now. So don't invoke the name of the Shoni law. That's a bad idea. All right, I'm going to quit rambling. I'm going to start talking about this case. So we're going to talk about health management today. Now, health management, this is kind of an interesting case about the case. There's some information about the case itself that's relevant, but I think that the more fascinating thing, and I hesitate to say this because this may go around to Scotty T, and he may hear that I said stuff like this, but it had to do with the legal ramifications of this particular case. And so if you read at the beginning of the case, it was talking about the nature of class action lawsuits. And class action lawsuits have existed for a long time. I think they actually date back to the 1800s. But they really didn't achieve prominence until the late 1960s. I think the first modern class action lawsuit was actually 1966. And they started becoming a lot more popular in the 1970s, which intuitively it makes sense. Because if you think about one person going up to the corporation, first of all, the corporation has got infinite resources and infinite capacity to actually fight a lawsuit. Secondly, one person, what are they really going to achieve out of that lawsuit? The amount that the corporation is going to be liable for is going to be a minimal amount, so it's almost not worth it. The idea of being behind a class action lawsuit is if you get a whole bunch of people with similar concerns or similar issues together, then they can combine their interests and put up a united front with a reasonably sized legal team that has a vested interest in that, and then actually achieve something of substance. And it was a really good idea. I'm going to say the class action lawsuits have changed the landscape of litigation for good. The problem was that it had to do with kind of the who would be held liable. And old class action lawsuits had the idea that all parties who are identified in the lawsuit were held both jointly and severally liable. Did everybody catch that in the case? The idea of joint and several liability. Now, basically, all that means is that every single party in the lawsuit is going to be liable for making sure that the full amount of the lawsuit is met. Okay, so how do we use that as an analogy? Okay, so let's say that I'm just going to pick out the people who are too closest to me. Let's just say that Matt, Lotus, and I are all out and enjoying dinner, and we'll say Seabreeze because Seabreeze is one of my favorite places. And we all agreed to split the bill, because that's what people do. And then it comes up to divvy everything up. And then Matt and I said, oh, we left our wallets at home. This is all up to you, Lotus. Okay. Lotus actually has to pay the entire bill. Okay. That's joint and several liability. Okay. And that's why you never want to actually go to a meal with Matt or I, Lotus, because, we'll leave you hanging with the check. So just a good word of advice. So yeah, idea being is that joint and several liability puts the imposition on every party, and if one party cannot meet that obligation, then another party has to actually take up the mantle. How is this relevant? Well, it actually has to do with financial resources of accounting firms. Accounting firms have a lot of liquidity and they have a lot of financial resources, and they're in a position of constant litigation. So they became very attractive lawsuits for or attractive targets for lawsuits. So I actually dredged up a particular piece that I remember from my childhood. We were talking yesterday about 1980s cartoons. What was the Calvin Hobbes discussion came up? And, I don't know why that popped up. The Calvin Hobbes discussion popped up. This is one that's actually a little bit older, but still fairly beloved. It's a cartoon called Bloom County. And so, if you're not familiar with this, it's very weird. It's kind of it's basically supposed to be a small town type area, but the inhabitants are not all what you anticipate. There are some human inhabitants, but there's also like a penguin, there's a pig, there's a rabbit. So then these are all anthropomorphized characters. But a little bit of background behind this is that back in the 1980s, Madonna, very well-known singer at the time, I think everybody's probably still heard of Madonna, right? It's like, yeah. So think of what's the lady who sings Sabrina Carpenter. Think of 1980s version of Sabrina Carpenter. Okay, yeah. So that's kind of Madonna was, and she was very well known, big pop star, and she was married to a very well known actor, Sean Penn. And Sean Penn was kind of well known for his temper, and because they were celebrities, they were a prickly pair. They were all constantly out together, and the paparazzi chased them around. And then there was no story about this that Sean Penn got into an altercation with paparazzi. So Bloom County made a joke about this. Steve Dallas, who's a lawyer, but he moonlighted as a photographer, he actually took a picture of Sean Penn, and Sean Penn headbutted him and put him into this cast right here that you can kind of see. So he's actually trying to determine who he's going to sue. And basically, he said, "Can you sue Sean Penn?" And the answer is no. I'm a little bit afraid that he'll come out at me or have reprisal against me. Then said Madonna, no, same problems, that she'll come after and attack me. Then Opus, which was the guy who actually hired him to do the big picture in the first place, and they basically said Opus is probably the one responsible for this one, but he doesn't have any money. They said the Nicolta Camera Company. It says, okay, this camera company basically has gobs of liquid cash, was criminally negligent in not putting stickers on their cameras which read, "Warning, physical injury may result from photographing psychopathic Hollywood hotheads." Okay, and so basically his response was that he was going to go sue the Nicolta Camera Company because of their liquidity and because they basically were reckless and not just saying that he might get headbutted by a Hollywood psychopath. And then it says this one fantastic statement there in America, land of the lawsuit. God bless her. And so, yeah, I wonder if that's how Professor Templeton wakes up every morning and he looks in the mirror and just says, "America, land of the lawsuit. God bless her." I could see him doing that. Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of a joke on the case of what we were going to be going into. But so in the mid 1990s, there was actually a move to reform. So early 1990s, 1992, Bill Clinton was elected president, and there was actually a big transition, big shift towards Democrat side. Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and they controlled the White House, which basically is showing how one party is in dominance of a political organization. That was kind of after 12 years of Republican dominance, because Reagan had been in the White House for 8 years before that, and then George Bush before that, George Bush Sr. And there was a movement at that time by Republican lawmakers, something called the Contract with America, which you may have heard about if you've taken a political science course, if you're familiar with this. This is kind of all background behind this, but one of the aspects of the Contract with America was trying to actually appease some of these interests that were in place, especially for corporations, try to arouse support. And it actually led to this something called the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995, which is in the case. That was actually talked about in the case. And the idea on the PSLRA was that they were going to remove this aspect of joint and several liability. And that was really, really big for corporations, especially for accounting firms who basically had these resources and that they were going to be held accountable regardless of whether they were responsible for the negligent act. And that was actually talked about in the case. There was actually an anecdote by one of the partners of the firm says we had to settle a lot of cases even knowing that we were not at fault, simply because it was just in our best interest to do so. So they're actually paying for doing nothing wrong. And that was kind of the idea behind the PSLRA. Now, the PSLRA basically changed the criteria for accountants to be or accounting firms to be held liable in these engagements. So let's say that you're an auditor on an engagement and you are performing the audit to your best of your ability, and the client goes through a massive financial statement fraud. The question is, are you liable? Under the original rules is that before the PSLRA, the prosecution just had to prove that the auditors were negligent or not negligent, were reckless in their approach, that they should have known better and they just did not do the job they're supposed to. Under the PSLRA, when that was passed in 1995, then that actually changed the criteria and the auditors had to knowingly participate in the fraud. So a bit of a different requirement there, saying that we're moving from recklessness to knowing participation in a fraud with respect to whether or not they actually have to be responsible. Now, that goes to this particular case here, because this is one of the early tests of the PSLRA as to whether or not the accounting firm was going to be responsible. So BDO was the audit firm in this particular case, and this is health management. And there's not really any question about the fraud here. We're going to talk about the nature of it, but there's some other issues that we're going to go into a little bit more detail about whether or not we could actually prove knowing participation in the fraud. And the way the prosecution tried to approach this is they tried to approach kind of partially from the concept of gross negligence. Like if they had not been knowing participants, then they would have done some very simple testing, like they would have done an inventory rollback test. They also tried to make an argument that there was a relationship between the CFO, the existing CFO at the time, what was his name? Bergman, Jeff Bergman, is that his name? Drew Bergman, and May Asai, that kind of basically impaired the relationship. That was how the prosecution approached this. Now, without going to spoiler, we're going to go ahead and say right now, BDO was not found guilty of knowing participation in the fraud, so they were not held liable under the PSLRA, which was kind of an interesting change at that time. But there's still plenty to talk about with respect to the nature of this fraud. All right, so what was the fraud scheme? Fraud scheme itself was pretty basic, something we've seen before, the overstatement of inventory. Basically, they said, all right, financial statement year end ends in April. We're gonna have the auditors in at the beginning of June. So they've got a month to kind of set up this fraud scheme. But the auditors were supposed to be there to perform the inventory counts. And basically, the auditors kind of put off of the inventory counts. And then they said that there was $1.8 million in inventory that was in transit. And if I remember correctly, that $1.8 million was a significant amount of the of HMI's inventory. It was something like 9% of their inventory. So it was a pretty substantial amount. And this was kind of the crux of the fraud because this inventory did not exist, but they were trying to prove existence of this inventory and going through the process protocols of doing it. And that was where the argument came up, along with kind of the, when they found out the fraud, what was the relationship between HMI and the auditors. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail on talking about what's happening in this particular case. So let's go ahead and start out with question number one. So BDO, as Mr. Attorney has pointed out correctly, that professional standards do not prohibit auditors and client personnel from being friends. At what point do such relationships result in violations of the auditor independence rules and guidelines? Provide hypothetical answers or hypothetical examples to strengthen your answer. So presumably everybody came with hypothetical in this situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Kirsten answer the first question, and then we're going to talk about some hypothetical examples. So what point do such relationships and violations of auditor independence and rules and such result in violation of auditor independence rules and such guidelines, Kirsten?
So we think it's fine and right above friendship. It is appropriate for you to hug when you see each other for the first time in a while, then you are too close. Yeah.
All right, that's distinct and to the point. Okay, so what do you think about the relationship between Bergman and Sy? Do you think that was would that be a violation of the rule?
Yeah.
There's no bright line criteria is the problem, and so it's all subjective in this particular situation. Now, one of the arguments in this particular scenario was talking about, yeah, there definitely were very close. Sy was the former senior when Bergman was the manager on the audit, or maybe it was the director, the head of the audit, and she was the manager. I can't remember the exact terms, but Bergman came onto the client, she took over, and they were still pretty close. Their families vacationed together. Bergman's wife hung out with Sy, and they were pretty close. And there was also a discussion about Sai taking over and coming to HMI at some point in the future. So all of this is kind of information saying this is a really close relationship, probably too close for this client friendship relationship that we can have here. So that's consistency. So I think that's an argument with that. Now, this is the key point though. Did any of this violate accounting standards? No, there's not a clear violation of accounting standards in any of this. So the problem is that if we don't have a clear violation of accounting standards, can we actually say that this is a violation of the rules? And the answer is, by the letter of the law, no. Okay. Can we say that there was a violation of the spirit of the law, or the spirit of the rule? Possibly. Okay, we could possibly say that. I don't think everybody's really hesitant to take a position that says, if I say one thing, Dr. Barnes is going to call me out and say the other direction. So I don't want to be called out. Take a position. Say, yes, it's probably a violation of the rules. So what do we have in accounting vernacular that kind of relates to this? All right. So we got the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. And generally, we as accountants try to follow the spirit of the rule or the spirit of the law. What is that concept called? Substance over form? Yes. So we look at accounting rules and we try to say, what is the substance of a particular scenario? What is the substance of a transaction versus what is the form transaction? The form may actually be perfectly fine and representative of what the rules state, but it can be a gross representation of what reality is. And we can actually kind of loosely apply that to here. Substance over form may be applicable. Now, keep in mind, these are accounting standards. This is not directly relevant. You don't get to go arguing substance over form versus relationships, but I think this is a concept that we can apply to this particular scenario, at least loosely. All right, hypothetical examples. So we have John. What was your group's hypothetical example?
You said Olivia, an auditor who is friends and frequently vacations with a client CEO, AJ, and their families happen to be very close. Olivia notices inconsistencies in the company's financial statements, but chooses to overlook them because she doesn't want to create any change in their social status with AJ.
Okay, and that's a fair, and it's a good hypothetical example because you put two hypotheticals of Olivia and AJ, which are auditors' names, obviously, auditors' names. So yeah, good one. Let's see, group leader Colin. What does your group say?
He said if the auditor is auditing a company that they're just recently employed by.
Okay, so do we have rules in place for that now? Yes, we do have a cooling down period for auditors who used to work on that. Now, keep in mind, this is only in positions of financial influence. So if we're talking about somebody who goes in position of controller or CFO, I think we will talk about that a little bit later. So yeah, that's a particularly relevant one. And then Maddie, what did you say? I'm sorry, Madeline, my apologies. I saw Mad and then I was like, so Madeline, okay. My apologies.
If the client and the auditor are having a poker game every Friday or playing golf together on the weekends, could signal an outside observer that there might be a lack of independence.
Yeah. On the other hand, if one of them is much better than the other at poker or at golf, then there could be an undue influence in a negative direction, because the other person might want to get reprisal against that one. So that's a possibility as well. But good examples. So yeah, close relationships are something to be scrutinized. There are definitely some considerations about whether they break the independence rules, but we're more concerned about what the visibility and transparency represents. All right, question number 2. According to court testimony on June 20th, 1995, Drew Bergman recommended HMI's board of directors that Maya Sai be hired as the company's chief accounting officer. A week later, BDO issued its annual report on HMI's financial statements under present existing professional standards. With the situation that presented an independence problem for BDO sidemen. Defend your answer. So I'm going to flip the rotation. I'm going to start with Madeline on this one. What'd your group say on that one?
Under current independence standards, there's a 1-year cool-off period before an auditor can be hired. So she would have had to quit BDO in 1995 and wait until 1997 before she could start working at HMI.
Very good. So that does not mean that she had to leave BDO. It just means that she could no longer be involved in this engagement and had to be off for a period. So the actual guidelines, and these are PCOB guidelines, which were not in place in the 90s, but they were, the SB guidelines were derived from these, or the PCOB guidelines derived from the SB guidelines. So there can be no pending offers of employment for current clients. Okay, so you can't be on a current client where you got an offer of employment. And before taking a position of financial oversight for a client, an auditor must remain separate from the client engagement for at least 1 year, as Madeline pointed out. Okay, so this is called the cooling off period, which is a really important concept. So yeah, if you want to take a new job, if somebody wants to hire you as CFO, but you're currently auditing them, then you're gonna have to say, well, I would love to in a year from now. And then you need to go tell your audit partner, says, get me off this engagement. I got a sweet gig lined up. Okay. Which hopefully your audit partner just says, does that mean you're leaving? Yeah. So then, yeah, that would be an awkward discussion. And it's pretty common in engagements nowadays that happens, but it's important to note that's something that's been developed over time. All right. Question number 3, under what circumstances an inventory rollback or roll forward should be performed, and how valid is evidence yielded by this audit procedure? So this one is kind of an interesting question. I'm going to handle this question because this one is one that we didn't really have a lot of context for. So have we heard that either the term rollback or roll forward previously in auditing? Yes. First of all, which term have we heard more prominently? Roll forward, okay. And where did we hear that term initially? What context was that used? Was it used for inventory? It was used in some other area. We talked about roll forward testing back in 417. So that was property, plant, and equipment, okay? The idea behind roll forward testing is that we know what the beginning balance is. We're trying to prove the ending balance. So we test everything in the middle. If the beginning balance was correct, and we're trying to prove the ending balance, then testing everything in the middle will get us there, okay? How well does this work for property, plant, and equipment? Extremely well. Why? Because property, plant, and equipment has minimal transaction activity, okay? Minimal transaction activity. So testing the disposals and additions during the period, very easy. So let's kind of take a look and keep this in context, okay? So I'm spoiling this. So basically, what the semi-senior Jill Karnick was saying is that it's talking about she tried to perform roll forward testing. So she went all the way back to April 30th, 1994, and I just made these numbers up. I wasn't trying to be accurate on this, but saying the beginning inventory was a certain amount, and then we're trying to establish that this is $8 million. So if you calculate all the purchases and cost of goods sold that occurred during the period, then you can kind of determine what this number should be. Now, this is what the actual number was. This was the number after the fraud. So there's a $1.8 million difference. And assuming that these numbers could be validated, that was a logical approach. What is the problem with using this versus in inventory versus using this in property, plant, and equipment?
Is it obscene number of inventory transactions?
Yeah, there's an obscene number. I love that word. I love that word. Obscene number of inventory transactions. Talking about property, plant, and equipment, even if there's 100, that's a minimal amount. Probably there's hundreds of inventory transactions for a reasonably sized business in one day, much less within a period. So she said she tried it for 3 days and kind of gave up in frustration. And I can understand. If somebody told me to do inventory roll forward testing, I'd be like, you have got to be out of your mind. All right. There's just not really a plan to do that. So then they said, could this have been detected if there had been inventory rollback testing? Okay. So rollback testing, it probably is somewhat related to this concept of roll forward testing, right? Can we assume that that's probably the case? So logically speaking, if we talk about rollback testing, we're trying to prove this number right here, because this is the number that was listed as the beginning inventory as of April. So I say beginning inventory. During the period under audit, this is the ending inventory. But keep in mind that they were doing the audit around late June, early July. Okay. So if we start saying that this is the beginning for the inventory for the new year, if we know what the current inventory is, we can just test everything that's been changes in inventory, purchase, and cost of goods sold since the beginning of the year to back into this beginning inventory number. All right. So the idea, instead of starting here, calculating or testing this to prove this, we're saying we're starting here, testing this to prove this. Okay. Instead of moving forward, we're moving back. Hence the idea of being a rollback test. Okay. Now let's just talk about this intuitively speaking. Okay. Is this intuitively sensible? So we're talking about doing some testing over a period of time, about maybe a month and a half, okay? It's still a daunting task, but if they're trying to validate the amounts that are being processed here, this is probably a lot more reasonable than trying to perform roll forward testing. And they actually said in the case, said, well, if they'd done a rollback test, this whole fraud would have unraveled. And so they didn't, and that's why the fraud didn't unravel immediately. And the interesting thing about where the fraud can unravel, I don't know if that was brought up. So yeah, the nature of the fraud scheme, I forgot to mention it. When did the fraud unravel, by the way? It wasn't the auditors who did this, the rollback testing. The casual.
I just talking about it. I
Yeah.
said this in forensics last week. Don't commit crimes and tell people you're committing crimes.
That's right. So basically, the controller is talking to the new CFO, and I gotta imagine, I've said this in my head, it doesn't really give you the setting, but I imagine this is like around the water cooler, like the typical office scenario. So there's has to say, yeah, so you're the new CFO, so you're gonna be taking new responsibility for accounting for the fraud that we engaged in. It's like, what fraud? What are you talking about? Oh, you know, the fraud, the $1.8 million of fictitious inventory. Yeah, I'm sure the old CFO let you in on that and made you aware of the whole situation. He did not. I did not know there was a massive financial statement fraud going on at this organization. Oh, there's not. Forget I said anything. Yeah, I just completely and totally made that up. Try to keep you on your toes. Yeah, I got to imagine the conversation with something like that. CFO was informed by the controller during a casual conversation, which I don't know about you all. I've had many casual conversations. I've never admitted to a $1.8 million financial statement fraud. So, you got to wonder where the priorities of that individual are. So rollback testing, assuming inventory number correct. So if there a manual count and then test changes to validate the starting number. That's basically all that we're doing here. I think this would have been a much more practical solution, particularly if we assume that $1.8 million is a very relevant number, which it very much was because it was the source of the fraud. We could have validated that. So yeah, some big concerns there. Question number 4, moving on. Question number 4, Jill Karnick amended an attempt to complete an inventory roll forward because because of the considerable amount of work in the procedure involved. Do you believe she made an appropriate decision given the circumstances you face? Colin, this is like the easiest question ever asked of anyone. Okay, so what do you think? Do you think it was an appropriate decision? Yeah, I would agree to that too. Now you could have been divisive. You could have said no. We could have gotten an argument, but I appreciate your consistency. Okay. How should auditors weigh the cost of an audit procedure in terms of time and other resources against the quantity and quality of evidence that it yields? So this is a little bit more of a subjective question, but what would your group say about that particular one?
We said that, this makes sense now that I'm reading it over, but we said auditors should weigh the cost of an audit procedure to the quality of evidence that is going to be obtained. If it's costly, the audit procedure returns highly reliable evidence in a high risk area, it might be justified to go through with it.
Right. So we've talked about this concept before. All right. We talked about this concept before. Could we get an absolute guarantee, hypothetically, theoretically, okay, we're looking at a hypothetical theoretical environment. Theoretically, could we get an absolute guarantee of what the numbers should be within the financial statements? Is that possible in a theoretical framework? Yes, in a theoretical framework, we could if we had infinite time and resources. Now, do we as auditors have infinite time and resources? No, we've talked about that concept about not having infinite time or resources. Hence, we have 2 words that reflect the fact that we do not have infinite time and resources. What are those words? Reasonable assurance. Yes, reasonable assurance, that reflection back from 417. So keep in mind that whenever we're performing an audit procedure, we want the benefit derived from that audit procedure to be less than the costs of conducting that audit procedure. And that's a general guideline. We talked about in forensics. Remember, I talked about my anecdote saying I did a forensic engagement where the fraud itself was $2,000 and the investigation was $20,000. I mean, that's kind of an exception to the rule, but it's also kind of a given difference to what we're talking about here. In general, if we're talking about audit, we want to make sure that any benefit derived from the procedures is going to outweigh the cost of doing those procedures. It doesn't make sense otherwise. And that kind of relates to the quality of evidence. If it's low quality evidence, then it's probably not worth spending a lot of time on. Now, we think about stuff like really low reliability evidence, observation, inquiry. And it's like, why do we bother with that type of evidence? Well, how difficult is it to conduct observation or inquiry? Like, can I observe what you all are doing right now? Yeah, I'm doing it right now. As I talk, I'm observing, okay? One of you is yawning and I don't appreciate it, okay? Actually, it's multiples of you, and it's okay, I get it. All right, but yeah, and I can inquire, I can ask questions of you all. It's very, very easy to do. So that's why there's a trade-off and say, yes, it's low reliability, but it's very, very simple. It's very, very low cost for me to do that. And so we consider that quality benefit trade-off. And if we're going to need higher quality evidence, then that's where we're going to have to justify, is it worth the cost? Is it worth the time of trying to collect that evidence? So that's kind of the interesting question that we get into with this particular situation. All right, question number 5. Should the results of inconclusive audit tests be included in audit work papers? Defend your answer. Okay, John, what did your group say?
We said yes, all work should be documented, even if it's not what the auditor suspected or it seems invaluable. The work was performed and could potentially be useful in the future. if they're ever investigated. And we also said, in addition, the procedures formed were still factored into the opinion of the financial statements.
Okay, so I think that that's a solid answer. I would like to kind of talk a little bit about something that you alluded to that kind of will help us back into what the perspective is. So we talk about what goes into documentation. This was stuff from chapter 5 way back in 417. And we talk about information that goes into documentation. Documentation includes information that supports the opinion rendered, correct? Do we also include information that is inconsistent with the opinion rendered? Yes, we do. We include information that both supports and contradicts the opinion that we're rendering as auditors. Okay, because we want to provide a complete picture of the work that's being performed. Now, this is a little bit different. This is not saying it's inconsistent with the opinion, but it's just not, it's inclusive work. It's basically, we got no results out of it. Okay, this would basically be the equivalent of a scope limitation. Do we include a scope limitation in the working papers? So the question then is, if we don't put this information in there, this stuff that's just inconclusive, are we providing a full picture of the audit work performed? I think there's a strong argument to say no, we're not providing a full picture of the work, because just because we think it's inconclusive does not mean that another party won't get some value out of that information. Now, there is a contrasting perspective, okay? There's a contrasting perspective. Let's say that I put inclusive work. I basically say, I tried to perform this inventory roll report testing. I got frustrated after 3 days. I gave it up, all right? Then we go to the court and they see this stuff in the working papers and they see the consent of work and said, all right, so you knew this would be a solution to the problem. Why didn't you put it together? Are you just lazy? Is that something somebody would say in a court of law? Probably so. Will they question diligence, competence, and independence in that situation? Yeah. So there could be a legal reason why we would want to leave that out, because we don't want the extent of our work questioned. That being said, with respect to transparency and the information that we're trying to provide with respect to the working papers, I think there's an argument for leaving it in. There's a contrasting arguments for leaving it out because we want to be very, very careful about the questioning of the extent of our work. But let's talk about, let's say that they know that I did this work and I said, well, I didn't put it in there because I didn't ever finish the work and it was inconclusive and blah, 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 blah. What is the court going to naturally assume if I leave that work out? They're going to assume the worst. They're going to assume that I just did not do anything, did not do a good job, that I was lazy, I was incompetent, something along those lines. So even if though we're worried about leaving it in, people will question my integrity or question my work ethic. Putting it out is a sure way to get people to question your work ethic. Leave it out. So yeah, ultimately, I would argue that leaving it in is probably more valuable than removing it. My perspective, though, my perspective. Some of you may disagree with me, and that's just fine until it comes to quiz time. All right. A major focus of the trial in the case was BD assignment's consideration of and response to red flags apparent during the 1995 HMI audit. Define or describe the phrase red flags. Kirsten, have you heard this term before? Okay.
Red flags are things that like seem extremely wrong. Sus.
Sus. It's a good term. Okay. So explain the impact of red flags identified by the auditors in each major phase audit.
We said when there's a red flag, this means there needs to be more effort put into investigating the area of the red flag. Red flags could be indications wrong. And planning, if any red flags are identified, this will lower detection risk, lower tolerance, impacting the amount of testing that will need to be conducted. During the audit, this will mean auditors will need to rely more on further substantive testing. At the end of the audit, if any red flags are still present, this could impact it.
Yep. So covered all three of the areas that I was concerned about. So we've got basically three general areas of audit. Now, notice I didn't say phases because there's multiple phases, but we've got three general areas, okay? Prior to the audit, all right? As Kirsten pointed out, areas of emphasis, things that we should focus on. During the audit, so we can think about this test of controls and substantive testing, okay? We have to update our assumptions because we see something that we didn't expect and maybe adjust our testing plan to adapt to the new red flags. And then at the end of the audit, we still see red flags. We ask ourselves, did we screw up or did the client screw up? Is this going to affect our approach, our opinion that we rendered? And so we ask those questions there. So yeah, good analysis there. All right, last question. The PSLRA requires auditors to report the SEC illegal acts that have a material effect on the client's financial statements, assuming client management refuses to do so. Briefly describe three hypothetical situations involving potential illegal acts discovered by the auditors Indicate whether auditors involved in these situations and should insist the client manager report the given item to the SEC and defend your decision for each item. All right, so this is the three hypotheticals that everybody was talking about on Monday. So everybody's going to have a hypothetical here. So we'll start back with Kirsten. Give me a hypothetical act and what was your analysis by your group?
The auditor finds a material logs related profits. There's need to report all findings, and if there's a material weakness, they need to report this to everyone. If the act is clearly illegal, then the SEC needs to be involved.
Okay. So let's break that down a little bit. So we're talking about whether or not what will be the material reports the SEC illegal acts that have a material effect. Okay. So in this particular situation, we're talking about a fraud that involves a understatement of cost of goods sold, presumably an overstatement of inventory, and management is basically with the perpetrators there. So first of all, would this be something that we would go to management about probably if we found this type of fraud? Probably not, because they're the ones who actually likely perpetrated the fraud. And now this is an assumption. If we say like it was like the situation like JGI, Jack Greenberg, where the fraud is being perpetrated by one member of management, we could report to a higher level of management. So that's a possibility. But if we're talking about the fraud is at general executive level as a whole, who are we going to go report to primarily? Who's going to be our first stop before we go to the SEC? Those charged with governance, okay? It's going to be like the audit committee or the board of directors, depending on the nature of the organization that we're auditing. But then we're going to go to the SEC because we're going to do that. So that's a good example of that. All right, John, what was your group's example or one of your group's hypotheticals?
You said significant unreported tax liabilities, and an auditor discovers that a company has deliberately omitted large amounts of taxable income from their financial statements. This leads to substantially understated tax liabilities. And then we said auditors should insist on reporting this to SEC as the deliberate non-disclosure of material tax liabilities, the serious legal act that could significantly impact the company's financial position and the investor perception.
So this is kind of an interesting one because this is kind of a similar fraud in that we would probably report this to the audit committee first of all to note that there's an issue going on there because going on the highest level of management. Do we think stakeholders would interpret this type of fraud the same way they would interpret an underrepresentation of or a overstatement of inventory? So underrepresentation of cost of goods sold. So how would you look at if you're a stakeholder and you're looking at a disclosure that the company has committed a financial reporting fraud with respect to their reporting of inventory? You would kind of say, all right, that's a very objective fraud that they are committing. They're clearly saying something does not exist or something exists when in fact it does not. All right. Is there the same kind of could the same weight be given to a tax issue? So is tax more or less subjective than reporting of inventory? I would say the tax reporting is probably more subjective than inventory. Now, Dr. Caden or Dr. Deers may come rushing down here in just a second and argue with me, okay? But there's definitely a view of the taxation is going to be more of a subjective view, and that there's tax issues all the time, and people are constantly arguing with those. So this is something that is certainly going to be important to report. But how would stakeholders perceive this information? Would they perceive it the same way as a financial statement fraud relating to inventory? Perhaps not, okay? Now, what is the whole point of this? The whole point is to say that still this information needs to be disclosed in order for people to be able to make their own minds up, to be able to come with a decision. Because if we don't actually disclose this information, it doesn't matter whether it's relevant or not. We've not given the opportunity to external stakeholders to be able to make a decision on their own parts. So I think this is an interesting one, talking about the nature of tax, simply because it is more subjective an approach than inventory measurement. Colin, what's your group say?
Said a client recognizes the revenue of their sales before a product is sent to the customer.
Okay, so basically like a channel stuffing scheme type thing like that. All right, so yeah, and this is going to relate to kind of the same idea as inventory misstatement. Channel stuffing scheme is more about directly recognizing sales and front loading the sales up. So yeah, I think we can kind of say that that's going to be problematic. And again, has the same issues with the inventory overstatement. This would be at the highest level of management, or presumably higher level of management, that we need to report to those charging companies for the SEC, and it would need to be reported externally so people would know the impact of it, the direct material effect. All right, last but not least, Madeline, what would your group say on here?
One of ours was that the company is pumping and dumping meme coins and marketing them as legitimate stable investments.
Oh, all right, I love this one. Okay, so what did you, how would this be an impact? So this is obviously a different situation. So, could there be an argument here made by the company that this is legitimate business practice?
It's been prosecuted by the SEC.
Yes, so that's okay. That's a fair point. Okay, let me change the scenario. Okay. Back in 2015, could there be an argument this is a legitimate business practice? Sure. Okay. So the reason I'm making this argument has to do with regulation related to crypto assets tends to be a little bit less stable than the regulation related to stockholders equity. I guess the point I was trying to make here is that this is one of those ones that there's, especially if there's a lack of transparency on, there's a question about the legality of it. Now, it really depends on the nature of the organization, nature of the crypto asset in question. Ethically speaking, can we make an argument that this is a gross breach of ethics and should probably be disclosed regardless of whether it represents true financial statement fraud? Probably so, okay. How many of you would be really, really happy if you heard the company you were investing in was doing pump and dump schemes with meme coins? Unless it was Dogecoin, which is now an established crypto asset, I wouldn't have anything with it. Okay, yeah, I'd be really, really upset about that.
Depends what side you're on.
It depends which side you're on. I don't know how much Dogecoin do you have in your portfolio, Colin?
A little bit.
A little bit? All right. All right. Yeah, and I'm gonna regret those words because I'm joking around right now, and Colin's gonna come back and he's gonna be a wealthy investor. And we're gonna name the school after him. So. All right. I will see you all, most of you all tomorrow. Those of you who won't, have a good break.